charts that show comparisons come in two main flavors. We have line charts, which compare values over time, and we have bar charts, whether that's vertical or horizontal, or circle charts, which we'll talk about, or various sortings. But regardless, all of these bar charts will show to compare values between categories. So line charts over time, bar charts between categories. So with a line chart, pretty simple. We have on our horizontal axis time, whether that's measured in years or days or whatever, and then on our vertical axis we have some numerical quantity that we care about. And again, it has to be kind of numerical because it doesn't make sense necessarily to be displaying categories over time. So here we have CO2 emissions as a function of time, and we can compare then the values later in time to the values earlier in time. Now notice that you might ask, is there a relationship between time and CO2 emissions? Is there a trend? That would be another step, and you might be pushing yourself into kind of the relationship camp, and we'll talk more about that when time comes. But here we're really thinking about simply comparing value at time A to the value at time B. So contrast that to a little bit more complicated example where we're not only showing the CO2 emissions over time for the entire world, but we've actually broken it down by country. So we can add in a categorical variable here, in this particular case through hue, hue meaning the color, just as a reminder. And so we can actually integrate another variable into this display. Now the question is, does that make the chart too busy? Can we still derive clear insights from it? And that's a case-by-case basis, but we can certainly get at least one more variable in here if we like. And remember, the reason we're using hue here rather than saturation or shape or anything like this is if we move down that Cleveland and McGill list, we've already used position for our two most important variables, namely time and CO2 emissions. And so if we cannot use position and we have a nominal categorical variable that we want to put in, the next best option is hue. That's why we're using it here, not saturation, not shape, not texture or any of these other, or size or any of these weird things. Like, we are using this on purpose because according to the evidence, according to the empirical studies about how people process visual information, hue is the next best option if we want to put in a categorical variable. So we can compare all of this to bar charts. So bar charts are comparisons of numeric variables. Here, a count between categories. And so here the categories are regions. So notice that we have, again, position indicated by the categorical variable itself along the horizontal axis, and the numerical variable, the count, along the vertical axis. And we can do this in one of two ways. And so notice that the only thing that changes between these two figures is the scale of the vertical axis. We can display it by total count if we care about the actual count itself. If you want to show values relative to the whole, we just scale this axis so that instead of being the actual count, it's percent of the total. So if we added up all of these percents, we would get 100%. So again, this is to not a matter of which chart to use. It's a matter of, given that you're going to use a bar chart, what subtle changes do you want to make to the way that chart is formatted in order to drive your particular point home? If your goal was to show percentage of the whole, or compare the percentage that one country or one region contributes versus another, then fine, use it like this. If the goal was to instead show a comparison between absolute contribution, absolute meaning the actual number of gigatons of CO2, then we should do it in a separate way, or something like this. So we also have a choice on the horizontal axis. So not only do we have a choice on the vertical axis about how we display this in terms of percent versus absolute, but we have a choice down here too. The big idea is, do we sort it or not? And the answer is, if you want to emphasize the lookup capacity of the bar chart, meaning I want to be able to look up a particular region, then you should sort it alphabetically to make that lookup as easy as possible. If instead your primary purpose is to show these differences and really, like, for instance, maybe look at the top, maybe look at the bottom, maybe look at the drop from one to the other, then you want to sort these things in terms of their vertical axis value. And again, this is getting to be a little bit more more detailed, but this is really where things start to sing. Like this is where like the difference between a good visualization or let's say an okay visualization and a very good visualization comes down to these types of decisions. But what do we sort? Do we not sort? Or do we use length? Or do we use position? So here we've actually made it much more minimalistic by just kind of having dots rather than the full bars. Again, this is to adhere as much as we can to the Cleveland and McGill strictures or recommendations where they were saying actually position is better than length in order to convey a numeric variable. So this is slightly different but gets its own name. It's called a circle chart. And we can also flip the axes here. So why would we want to do a horizontal chart here? I know the font is very small, but the idea here is if I have many of these categories, so much so that if I put them going like this, it's not going to read very well. Or if these names are long enough that I want someone to be able to read it as if they were reading the printed language rather than have to turn their head and read these things vertically, then I want to use a horizontal bar or circle chart. Again, it may seem like a small difference, but it can make all the difference in the world in making your visualization approachable or kind of a little bit more opaque to your audience. So in a future video, we're actually going to make all of these things in Tableau and see kind of how we can do these things, you know, this flip in a simple way, and how we can do sorts and all of this stuff. It's all very straightforward. We just have to kind of make sure that we practice these tools so they come naturally when we're out there doing our thing.